if we wanted to point to the largest project of standardization now being undertaken in the world, it is the effort to create individual freehold property all over the world. As we speak, in hundreds of countries in the global south, there are survey teams working out of a World Bank module who are surveying land and issuing individual freehold title to this land in an effort to create, across the globe, the model of individual freehold property that exists in the North Atlantic region. The assumption, of course, by neoliberal economics is that it is only this creation, and Hernando de Soto and so on, is that it is only this creation of individual freehold property that will allow land to seek its highest value in the market, to create a national market for land, so that land is not going to waste, so that it is used for, people will bid up rents and prices because they have more valuable uses for this land than it would otherwise have if it were locked up and could not be sold. It must, in a sense, seek its highest return. It must be turned over to the highest bidder. There are also projects, as you know, of privatization, the effort to create property law in general that matches North Atlantic practices, and that means intellectual property rights, the rights governing the movement of capital, the organization of central banks so that they all follow a standardized central bank profile, the creation of convertible currencies, creation of homogeneous techniques of national statistics so that international comparisons can be made. That is to say, similar ways of estimating the economically active population, of estimating disguised unemployment, of estimating gross domestic product, of estimating unemployment, of estimating changes in patterns of wealth distribution, income and growth. The creation of patent law, the elimination of a whole series of subsidies that were part of a previous order. This is achieved, I might add, by what a colleague of mine once called by the word throffer. Throffer is his idea of capturing a combination of a threat and an offer. The structural adjustment loans that are made to the third world are a loan conditioned on following a whole series of regulations in terms of property, income tax, currencies, and so on. That is, it is structural adjustment conditionality in which the price of a loan is to harmonize your institutions with these North Atlantic standardized models. This project travels as a universal. But the crucial thing to notice is that this is not a universal. This is a 19th century vernacular from the North Atlantic region, stabilized there, that is cross-dressed, if you like, as a cosmopolitan universal. These are the institutions of a particular stabilization of North Atlantic capitalism. The imminent logic is that the North Atlantic businessman can get off an airplane, if it works, in Conakry, in Maputo, in Vientiane, in Asuncion, in Seoul, in Rangoon, in Ulaanbaatar, in Tirana, probably get off at a standardized international module airport, by the way, and find a thoroughly familiar institutional order. The legal order will be familiar to him or her. The ministry organizations will be familiar. The statistics, and in general, the institutional and legal order will be the same. And of course, it will be familiar to him, and the reason it will be familiar to him is because it is his vernacular. It is the vernacular of the North Atlantic institutions with which he is at home. Only the language, the cuisine, the music, the dress, the dance, and the geography will be different. And the natives will remain, of course, slightly distinctive. And that's because this cultural difference is itself a commodity that can be sold to tourists and so on. I think that one of the ways we ought to think about this is to think of the career of the language that is the mother tongue of many of us, and that is the history of the English language as a hegemonic language. This is, after all, those of us who speak English, it's a quaint minor dialect of the Germanic tongues, spoken in a tiny corner of the North Atlantic world, inflected, thank God, by the French of the Norman invaders and by the Latin church fathers, to the point where it became hegemonic. The sociolinguists have a joke which I rather like, which is the question that they ask is, what's the difference between a dialect and a national language? And the answer is that a national language is a dialect with an army. That's exactly the way in which English, if you like, became a cosmopolitan universal language. It came to power on a series of historical accidents, British imperialism and post-war American hegemony. But its origin is as a vernacular, and it still bears all the traces of that vernacular past and its historical origin and its associations. I was one of the most amusing and also tragic pictures that I noticed in a newspaper in the last year was a photograph of a Chinese student bicycling away from you as the viewer sees them. The bicyclist was wearing a t-shirt, and on the back of it, it had a large circle with a red slash through it, and it said, "Fuck TOEFL." That is to say, there are millions and millions of Chinese students who are today cracking their heads every day to pass the TOEFL exam because it is their passport to this larger world that's controlled by the hegemony of English. Those of us who are born to the mother tongue of English are, if you think about it, we are paid an unearned dividend every day of our lives for having been born speaking without any trouble or effort the hegemonic language of the world. It's a very lucky coincidence of which we are the beneficiary, and at the very least ought to remain in a humble way conscious of. This brings us finally to close to the forces that in some sense contest this project, this neoliberal order, or at least elements of it. And those are the NGOs who do battle every day with the World Bank, with the IMF, and so on. They're mostly Western financed and mostly Western inspired. And you could argue they are themselves largely the bearers of North Atlantic institutional forms themselves. North Atlantic institutional forms and practices. A certain conception of human rights, certain conceptions of women's emancipation, certain conceptions of voting rights and election monitoring, certain conceptions of transparency, of local government and participation. These are often, to many of us, emancipatory projects, but we must never forget the degree to which they are traveling North Atlantic Western modules of this European world. And they bear also their traces of this vernacular origin.